Hello, this is Kyle, and welcome to the first episode of the Literature Corner, where I will be talking about The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, as with all works of literature, there's so much to talk about in this that I can't possibly hope to cover everything, so I'd like you to think of this more as a platform which you can expand on, a set of ideas which you can develop your own conclusions from. Now, I have heard it suggested by some that this is overrated, which may or may not be true, but one thing you cannot deny is that Fitzgerald was a very intelligent writer, and that does come across in his work. In The Great Gatsby, there's a very thinly disguised message about the futility of ambition and striving for success. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on boats against the current, borne ceaselessly into the past. It's really quite a pessimistic outlook when you think about it, but it caught on because it came at the right time, when there were people out there starting to question the American dream. Another obvious context for the novel is that it is both written and set during the Roaring Twenties, supposedly a time of great economic progress and prosperity. Fitzgerald memorably coined the term the Jazz Age when describing this period of history. However, I see The Great Gatsby more as an expose of the reality that lies beneath the glossy exterior of the Jazz Age and the American dream. The novel is, of course, famous for its descriptions of lavish parties, full of colour and variety, something which the recent film adaptation went out of its way to portray. But perhaps more interesting is the description in Chapter 2 of the Valley of Ashes. A fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, and take the form of houses and chimneys, and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-grey men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Notice how many times the words grey and ashes appear in that description, and I think it's interesting to note at this point that one of the proposed titles for Fitzgerald's novel was Under the Red, White and Blue, and I would suggest that by that he meant as in the grim, grey reality which lies underneath the American dream and this supposedly prosperous age. And watching over all of this, you have a massive advertisement, The Eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which Wilson later refers to as literally being the eyes of God, which is a very powerful metaphor of the capitalism and the dominant force it holds over society, and particularly the lower levels, grinding these people down. And I guess it's kind of mocking the more theistic element of American ideology at the time as well. Another example of reality not being quite how it appears on the surface at first, of course, is Gatsby himself, because although we find out eventually that he made his money, he made his fortune through bootlegging and other illegitimate means, the persona which you initially see is a creation which he invented, an illusion, really, of upper-class respectability which he projects because just having the money is not enough to appeal to Daisy and to compete with the true upper-class Tom. Daisy is arguably, in the context of this novel, representative of the American dream. Gatsby pours all his ambition into her pursuit, and she then really becomes the physical embodiment of his dreams. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Gatsby goes after Daisy in the true spirit of the American dream, with the basis that anything can be achieved regardless of social background, but of course he soon runs into some difficulties. This is where some of the wonderful subtleties of Fitzgerald's writing actually start to come in. For example, Gatsby frequently uses the phrase old sport, assumedly in an attempt to try and make himself sound more like someone of old money upper class breeding, but then paradoxically his overuse of the expression actually makes it sound forced and not quite genuine. Tom's suspicions are really first aroused during the scene in chapter 6, where Gatsby doesn't realise that he's not wanted at a dinner party because he misinterprets the upper class etiquette, leading to Tom's memorable line that women meet all kinds of crazy fish. Later on, of course, the illusion is shattered completely when Tom finally confronts Gatsby and reveals the details of his illegal activities, and from that point on the affair with Daisy is over. Perhaps it is this Marxist tone which has made The Great Gatsby so popular among so many people, because when you think about it, almost none of the central characters are really relatable to the common person. They're summed up quite well by Daisy's quote in chapter 7, "What will we do with ourselves this afternoon, and the day after that, and the next 30 years? You know, they're rich people who've got too much money and not much to do. All they can do really is party and generally muck about." It is also interesting to note, in terms of character, that most are portrayed in quite a negative way and are actually quite unlikable. All the main characters also, perhaps with the exception of Nick, prove to be corrupt in some way. Even Gatsby is guilty of bootlegging, although it's important to remember that while his means may be corrupt, the incorruptible dream, which is his ultimate end, is not. This is where the first-person retrospective narrative becomes vitally important, and this is something you must talk about if you're studying this text academically at all. Because not only is Nick one of the few who without blood on his hands at the end, but all the events of the novel also lead perfectly on into his conclusion about Tom and Daisy. They were careless people. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they made. It is a very damning condemnation, really, which is aimed at all of the old money, rich upper class. But by this stage it fits perfectly with the sentiment of the reader, or at least that's how I felt. In a way you could say it's almost too perfect and too fitting to be real. A biased narration would also explain why Gatsby is about the only other redeemable character in the novel, because it is made quite clear in the opening that Nick has an almost romantic fascination in Gatsby, and perhaps this rose-tinted, infatuated view of reality is reflected in his interpretation of events. Some might point to the fact that Nick does say in the opening chapter that he is not a judgmental person by nature, but you have to consider that just by saying this, he actually draws attention to a possible lack of subjectivity in his narration, and that on this occasion he has made a judgment. So that's about all I have to talk about at the moment. One more thing I would like to say before I conclude is that literature is subjective, and each work is only defined by each individual reader. Indeed, without the reader, a text wouldn't exist. So, in other words, now it's up to you to pick up the book for yourself and make your own interpretations. In the meantime, you can also check out my Facebook page and my website, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.